Getting paid less than a coworker for doing the exact same job produces a very specific, very strong kind of anger, one that feels completely disproportionate to the actual dollar amount involved sometimes, even when the money itself barely matters. That reaction isn't unique to humans either. A famous experiment found something remarkably similar in a small monkey, and it may help explain why a sense of fairness exists in the first place, in any species that has one at all. Researchers use the term inequity aversion to describe a measurable, consistent negative reaction to unequal treatment, especially when that inequality involves receiving less than someone else for putting in the exact same effort toward the exact same task. This isn't simply a cultural lesson taught to children through fairy tales, playground rules, or a classroom curriculum designed specifically to teach it. Growing evidence suggests it runs considerably deeper than that, showing up in contexts and species where nobody could have specifically taught the underlying concept through language, deliberate instruction, or any kind of formal moral education whatsoever. In 2003, researchers Sarah Brosnan and Frans ran an experiment that became genuinely famous, and for good reason, eventually generating footage watched by millions of people online decades after the original study was even published. Two capuchin monkeys, positioned side by side where each could clearly see the other, were trained to complete an identical simple task, handing a small rock back to a researcher in exchange for a food reward. When both monkeys received the same reward, a piece of cucumber, they performed the task calmly and repeatedly without any noticeable issue at all, seemingly content with the arrangement. Everything changed the moment one monkey started receiving a far more desirable grape instead, for doing the exact same task with identical effort. The monkey still receiving cucumber, watching its neighbor get grapes for identical effort, reacted with clear, visible frustration, unmistakable to anyone watching the footage even without any scientific training. In video recordings of the experiment, the disadvantaged monkey can be seen refusing to complete the task at all, and in some cases, throwing the cucumber directly back at the researcher, rather than eating perfectly good food it would have happily accepted just minutes earlier under equal conditions with no comparison available. The reaction wasn't about hunger, or the cucumber itself being spoiled or inedible in some way. It was specifically, visibly triggered by the direct comparison to what the other monkey was receiving right next to it. The experimental setup itself was deliberately simple, which is part of why the results landed with such force. Both monkeys sat in adjacent, clearly visible enclosures, close enough to watch each other's entire exchange with the researcher in real time, removing any possibility that the disadvantaged monkey simply didn't notice what the other was receiving. Researchers repeated the exchange multiple times in a row, watching the reaction build with each additional round, rather than relying on a single isolated incident that could plausibly be dismissed as a fluke or a one-off mood. This kind of reaction makes real sense once you consider what sustained cooperation actually requires between individuals over time, especially across many repeated interactions, rather than just a single one-off exchange. If two group members contribute roughly equal effort towards some shared goal, but one consistently receives a smaller share of the resulting benefit, that imbalance creates a genuine incentive for the shorted individual to simply stop cooperating altogether, or to quietly start looking for a better arrangement elsewhere instead. A built-in system capable of detecting and reacting strongly to that kind of imbalance would have real value for any species relying heavily on cooperative relationships to survive, since it helps protect the whole arrangement from quietly falling apart over time, one small unfair exchange at a time. Similar reactions to unequal treatment have since been documented well beyond capuchin monkeys specifically. Across a genuinely wide range of cooperative animal species researchers have since gone on to test. Chimpanzees show comparable patterns in related experimental setups designed around the same basic principle. Perhaps more surprisingly, a 2012 study led by researcher Friederike Range found that dogs also reacted negatively when a companion dog received a reward for the same trained behavior while they received nothing at all, refusing to continue performing the trick even though they'd happily performed it many times before under equal conditions, with no reward disparity involved between the two animals. Human development research points in a strikingly similar direction. Studies using what researchers call violation of expectation methods, tracking where infants direct their attention and for how long, have found that even very young children reliably show surprise and increased attention when they observe an unequal, unjustified distribution of resources between two other individuals. This response shows up remarkably early in development, well before a child could have received extensive formal teaching about fairness as an abstract social or moral concept. There's a genuinely interesting wrinkle in this research worth mentioning directly. Both capuchins and humans react strongly to disadvantageous inequity, receiving less than someone else for equal effort. Reacting negatively to advantageous inequity, receiving more than someone else unfairly, appears to be rarer, develops later in human children, and shows up less consistently, if at all, in other primates studied so far. In other words, it seems considerably easier, across species, to notice when you're being shortchanged than to notice, or particularly mind, when you're the one unexpectedly coming out ahead. Researchers Peter Blake and Catherine McAuliffe ran a related study directly with children across a range of ages, giving pairs of kids the chance to accept or reject unequal divisions of a small reward through a simple, clearly explained game. Younger children readily accepted lopsided splits, even ones clearly favoring themselves over the other child in the pair. Older children, generally around age 8 and up, became noticeably more likely to reject an uneven split entirely. Sometimes even when rejecting it meant they personally received less than they otherwise would have walked away with, suggesting a more mature, generalized fairness principle, gradually taking shape well beyond simple self-interest, as children continued growing and developing socially. It's worth being fair about how debated this specific interpretation remains within the scientific community, despite how compelling the viral video footage tends to look at first glance. Some researchers, including Clive Wynne, have argued the capuchin reaction might be better explained by simpler mechanisms, general frustration at a broken reward expectation, rather than anything resembling a genuine, rich concept of fairness in the way humans typically understand and use that term in everyday moral reasoning. Distinguishing between true fairness detection and a simpler disappointment response triggered by an unmet expectation remains a genuinely open, actively studied question, without full agreement, yet among researchers working directly in this specific area of comparative psychology. Whatever the precise underlying mechanism eventually turns out to be, the practical pattern lines up remarkably well with lived human experience, across cultures, ages, and countless completely ordinary daily situations. That disproportionate flash of anger at even a small, seemingly trivial unfair situation, an unequal split, an unrecognized effort, a friend getting credit for shared work, maybe an old, evolutionarily protective system doing exactly what it was apparently built to do, flagging a threat to cooperation before that threat has any real chance to quietly spread, take hold, and undermine the entire relationship or group arrangement it was originally meant to protect. The next time an unfair situation bothers you more than the actual stakes involved seem to reasonably justify, you might be feeling something considerably older and considerably more useful than simple childish pettiness, running quietly in the background exactly as it was originally built to do. That's exactly the kind of hidden thread this channel exists to dig up. If you want more of these, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.